Okay, so we've been talking about the rise of all these repressive regimes. We've so far looked at Italy, Germany, Spain. I bet you didn't even know about Spain. Well, I'm going to give you another one that you probably didn't know about. Brazil. Um, Lots and lots of repressive regimes coming about during this time. So let's look at Brazil. As in Europe, parts of Latin America also became more conservative. Brazil was considered Latin America's sleeping giant because of its slow shift from agriculture to an industrial economy. The economy was dominated by large landowners, a fact that just frustrated the heck out of the members of the urban middle class. The economy was dominated by these large landowners, and as a result, those large landowners also dominated the political process. Compounding their frustration was that workers were suffering, caused in fact by the Great Depression. That led to a bloodless coup in 1930, which installed Getulio Vargas as president. Vargas's pro-industrial policies won him support from Virginia's bourgeoisie, or middle class. The economic liberalism left the urban middle classes to believe that their new leader was actually interested in establishing a democracy in Brazil. His actions, however, paralleled those of Italy's corporate state under Mussolini. While Brazil's industrial sector grew at a rapid rate, Vargas began to strip away individual political freedoms. His program that he called Estado Novo decreed government censorship of the press, abolition of political parties, imprisonment of political opponents, and hyper-nationalism. Basically, a belief of the superiority of one's nation over all others. Okay, and it's nationalism on steroids. Okay, and the single-minded promotion of national interests. Unlike European fascists, the Brazilian government did not praise or rely on violence to achieve and maintain control. This made the country end up looking more like less like a dictatorship and more liberal than what it actually was. World War II prompted the people of the Brazil to push for more democratic reform later. Now let's go back to Russia. Okay, so the last time that we looked at the Russian Revolution, where we left off, was in 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized the Russian government and established their own government led by the Bolshevik and communist Vladimir Lenin. The communists believed that workers would lead a collective property and just society. Okay, toward that long-lasting goal, the Soviet government abolished private trade, distributed crops to feed urban workers, and took over ownership of the country's factory and heavy industries. We're going from capitalism, where you have greed and private ownership, to socialism, where the government takes control of all these things on behalf of the public to redistribute them equally. To again, because we're trying to push to that communist society, that society where there is no want, there is no need. Everyone works for the betterment of society. Although Lenin and the Bolshevik Party had promised that famous slogan, peace, bread, and land, during World War I, they instead presided over a populace that faced starvation during the widespread Russian Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of Russians, Ukrainians, and others revolted against the Soviet government's actions. Urban factory workers and sailors went on strike. Peasants began to hoard their food stocks so that the government couldn't take them. Industrial and agricultural production dropped sharply as a result. In 1921, Lenin kind of realized that his little program wasn't working out so well because the Soviet economy was in complete collapse. And this is before the Great Depression. So he instituted a temporary retreat from communist economic policies. Under his new economic plan, he reintroduced private trade, allowing farmers to sell their products on a small scale. So this is the new economic plan, or what you also see as the NEP. So private trade is now allowed again, and farmers could sell their products on a small scale. The government, though, maintained strict political control. And the NEP came to an end when Lenin died in 1924. So here's a little fun fact before I go on. Lenin died, but you can go still see Lenin today. Yes, you can. You might be thinking, what are you talking about, Mr. May? Because Lenin's body was permanently preserved, and it sits under a glass case in the Kremlin, which you can still go and see. I'm putting the picture up here for you to see. They do the same thing to Stalin's at the end of Stalin's life, but unfortunately, you don't see Stalin's anymore because there was a bunch of de-Stalinization because of all the craziness that he did. But that's a separate story. But you can still go see Lenin's almost 100 years later after his death. He still looks like the day he died. I actually think he just looks like incredibly fake with all that makeup on. But, his body's been dead for 100 years. So let's talk about good old Joseph Stalin. Joseph, get ready for it, Joseph Vissarionovich Yugoslavia is what Joseph Stalin's actually birth-given name was. That actually probably is the hardest name that I've pronounced all year. It took me a long time to be able to pronounce that one. So how in the world did we go to Joseph Stalin then? Well, in his 30s, he took the name Stalin. From the Russian to mean man of steel. That's a lot easier to pronounce, so that's how we'll refer to him. Stalin grew up poor and an only child. His father was a shoemaker and an alcoholic who beat him constantly, and his mother was a laundress. As a boy, Stalin contracted smallpox, which left him with lifelong facial scars. As a teen, he earned a scholarship to attend seminary, a religious school, to become a priest in the nearby city and study for the priesthood in the Georgian Orthodox Church. While there, he began secretly reading the work of the German social philosopher, Marx, the Communist Manifesto, and became interested in the revolutionary movement against the Russian monarchy. In 1899, Stalin was expelled from seminary for missing exams, although he claimed it was for Marxist propaganda. He abandoned Lenin's NEP, and as he came to power, he instituted the first of what he called a 5-year plan. There's lots of these 5-year plans that he puts out, in which he attempted to transform the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, the Soviet Union, into an industrial power. He wanted his largely agricultural nation to catch up to the industrial nations of the West. At the same time, Stalin collectivized agriculture, a process in which farmland was taken from private owners and given to collectives to manage. In theory, a collective, which was called a kolkhoz, was a group of peasants who freely joined together to farm a certain portion of the land. They were going pushing that towards that communism. It's collectively. They're joining together freely to farm the land. In practice, though, peasants were forced by the state to work on a specific collective and were expected to follow detailed plans and reach specific goals or quotas set by the government. That is very much a communist state ideology there. We see it in North Korea as well. We saw it in China as well. The elimination of private land ownership and the forced redistribution of land, livestock, and tools enraged farmers in Russia. Each year, the government seized food to send to the cities, and the farmers retaliated by actually burning their crops and killing their livestock. Many actually decided to move to the cities for a better life. A series of 5-year plans had mixed results. The collectivization of agriculture was a huge and massive failure. Millions of peasants starved to death, especially in the Ukraine, which is seen as the breadbasket of Russia, because of where really the grain, the main part of its grain, because it's good arable land. Remember, most of Russia, as in the actual country, is pretty cold. You can't grow a whole lot there. Heavy industry grew tremendously, though, in the 1930s. There was plenty of factory jobs available, and the cost of living was low. So that's why we have mixed results from these 5-year plans. Stalin builds a cult of personality around himself. Any totalitarian dictator, these ones we've already talked about, ones that we will continue to talk about, they have to build a cult of personality, meaning they have to build this ideology where the people become brainwashed and everything glorifies the leader. They wear pins with the leader's face on them. The children are taught about the often mystical or glorious way of the leader's early life, often which is just completely mystified and made up in a lot of ways. There's constant pictures of the leader. That's a call to personality. We see that with any totalitarian dictator, but Stalin was a master of it. Cities were renamed in his honor, Stalingrad, for example. Soviet history books were rewritten to give him a more prominent role in the revolution and mythologize other aspects of his life. He was the subject of flattering artwork, literature, and music, and his name became part of the Soviet national anthem. His government also controlled the Soviet media. Stalin's brutal regime is widely condemned today. He will go down as the largest, and hopefully no one will ever beat him at this, mass murderer in history. It is hard to ping an exact number on him because so many are unaccounted for in terms of deaths, but some historians put up his murders of 50 million plus more people. Hitler in the Holocaust alone killed about 12 million. Okay, I'm not justifying; those are still lives, and both of them were terrible in many different ways. I'm just trying to give you some perspective here. So Stalin ruled by terror and with a totalitarian grip in order to eliminate anyone who might oppose him. He expanded the powers of the secret police, which you know as the KGB, and encouraged citizens to spy on one another, and had millions of people killed or sent to gulags, these camps, which were forced labor camps, often many of them in Siberia, where you would freeze to death. During the second half of the 1930s, Stalin instituted what was called the Great Purge, which was a series of campaigns designed to rid the Communist Party, the military, and other parts of Soviet society from those he considered a threat. His agricultural policies, though, led to the deaths of many millions of Soviet citizens. He left no room for opposition within the Communist Party. Whether a party member was truly a threat or not, he left no room for contemplation there. He simply nipped the perceived problem in the bud through murder. He even purged the Red Army at a time which the Soviet Union was engaged in internal conflict. 36,000 Red Army officials were executed, shipped to gulags, or dismissed from service. All his top generals completely gone. And this is happening ongoing during World War II. Not really a great idea. In a climate where stamp collectors could be shot for valuing old foreign stamps over new Soviet ones featuring Stalin's portrait, and astronomers could be executed for taking an ideologically incorrect position on the sunspots, not even the Red Army was above suspicion. He purged everyone. People around him were scared to death of him. If you breathed wrong, you were dead. And he had this really, because he's so maniacal, and lots, you can look up stuff on mental illness there with Stalin, because there's lots that believe he also suffered from mental illness. But as he eliminated these people, he actually had photographs of himself with these people edited to show them being gone. And I'm going to show you these. As they went on, more and more people disappeared from these photos to basically be erased from history. So because Stalin kept right control of the press, details of his atrocity went largely unreported. There are very few pictures that I can share with you because they weren't taken. In the 1930s, an economically depressed world viewed the USSR with a mix of both horror and wonder. The USSR was rapidly industrializing and increasing its military power. It presented challenges to capitalist countries who were experiencing high unemployment, like the United States. In the 1930s, the Soviet government began promoting socialist realism. So paintings and films had to be done in a realistic manner with an uplifting moral that showed the advantages of socialism, and of course, Stalin as well, too. We'll be back to Stalin, don't worry. Now we're going to shift back to Latin America, to Mexico. So Mexico entered the 20th century as an independent nation, firmly under the control of the dictator Porfirio Diaz. He allowed much of his country's resources to come under the control of foreign investors, particularly those from the United States. Mexican peasants held almost no land. 97% of the land was controlled by the wealthiest 1% of the population. When Diaz failed, Francisco Madero, the opposition candidate for president in 1910, revolution broke out. Or excuse me, he didn't fail. He jailed Francisco Madero. Revolution broke out and insurrections occurred in Mexico. What's an insurrection? It's an uprising. Madero escaped from jail and set up a revolutionary office in El Paso. In 1911, Madero's troops, under the command of Francisco Pancho, as he's often known, Villa, defeated Mexican troops, sending Diaz into exile. Madero was elected president. One revolutionary leader, Emiliano Zapata, gave voice to the injustice peasants felt towards unfair distribution of land and wealth. He began the process of redistributing the land to impoverished peasants. And while the goals of land redistribution, universal suffrage, and public education were not soon realized, they were written into the Mexican Constitution in 1917. In the 30s, land reform efforts were more successful under Lázaro Cárdenas. His regime also nationalized the oil industry. When you nationalize something, it means that the government takes over an industry. So the government took over the oil industry in Mexico, angering foreign investors. Why? Because, well, they couldn't put their dirty hands in it. Now we move to China. And China has a remarkable history. So the last that we left off in China, you were looking at the end of the Qing dynasty, the century of humiliation, which the Chinese still refer to it today as. In fact, there's even a day commemorating the century of humiliation celebrated in China Day. Well, it's not really celebrated, it's memorialized to realize how terribly this Chinese backwardness during the 19th century put them behind. So following the fall of the Qing in 1911, China did not have a stable government until 1949. It's basically in upheaval all the way through those years. The intervening years brought tremendous upheaval and division in the nation. Dr. Sun Yat-sen became the leader of the Chinese Republic in 1912, but the central government was weak, as much of China was controlled by warlords. We talked about that problem under the Qing, each of those being in control of their own specific region. That was a holdover of that Qing dynasty, which had relied on these regional armies. These regional armies lacked standardization and rendering control by a central government really almost impossible. Urban intellectual and college students in China had high hopes for the Paris Peace Conference in 1918 that ended World War I. They expected that the country would finally win independence from Western European control. You and I both know that doesn't happen. Instead, the Big Four decided to give much of China's European-controlled territory, those spheres of influence, to Japan, which had given a great deal of economic aid to the Allies during World War I. With the news, when that news reached China, cities revolted. Though college students and elite youth led that May 4th movement, that revolt against the Treaty of Versailles, which we talked about in the last chapter, all classes in urban populated areas participated in the protests. Two main groups then struggled for power in the wake of the protests: the Communists and the Nationalists. The Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, was led by a gentleman by the name of Mao Zedong, or sometimes you also see it Mao Tse-tung, okay? And he was the son of a prosperous peasant who was inspired by the communist revolution that he saw in Russia. Mao believed that the Chinese Communist Revolution could be based on the revolt of peasants who made up the vast majority of China's population. The Chinese Nationalist Party was led by Sun Yat-sen. He was devoted to full independence and allied with Mao's forces to free China from foreign domination and overthrow the warlords. So this is like the one time, actually there's one other time, where the two of them actually ally together to free China of the outside influence of the warlords as well. The Communist Party was also known as Kuomintang, and I want you to know that because you will see it referred to as that sometimes. In 1925, Sun Yat-sen died, and his successor was a man by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, who took control of the Nationalist Party. He was conservative and had deep-seated distrust of communism. In 1927, his forces attacked and nearly annihilated Mao's communist forces, initiating the Chinese Civil War. Mao and his remnants of the Chinese Communist Party, the Kuomintang, retreated into China's interior. For several years there, they trained in hiding. Chiang Kai-shek made a mistake when he didn't wipe them out, and he's going to live to regret that. In 1934, Chiang Kai-shek's forces discovered them and attacked Mao's army stationed in the rural area of China. After the attack, Mao's forces began what is now known as the Long March. This trek, which covered 6,000 miles, took an entire year and traversed some of the world's most treacherous mountains, deepest marshes, and driest deserts. Of the 80,000 men who began the walk, only 10,000 of the communists remained to assemble in 1935 in northern China. The Long March, though, brought popularity to the communists and admiration for many of the Chinese. In fact, Chinese men joined as the march went on, who were in awe of Mao and his army's tremendous stamina from this march. The nationalist Kuomintang continued to rule much of China during the 1930s. Hold on one second here. You know what I just told you? I told you a falsehood. I told you the Chinese Communist Party was called Kuomintang. The Chinese Communist Party was not. The Nationalist Party was called Kuomintang. Sorry, let's fix that in your notes there. So it continued to rule China during the 1930s. Chiang Kai-shek was out of touch, though, with the diverse needs of the Chinese people. He advocated for Confucianism at a time when the old traditions were no longer in vogue, means they were no longer popular. Why? Because that was seen as something that was part of the century of humiliation, and look where that got us. Corruption was also rampant in the national government, and those factors alienated Chinese urban intellectuals, who basically were tired of the nationalists. To make matters worse, Japan's expansionism into China in the 1930s severely weakened the country. In 1935, the nationalists and the communists suspended their civil war to unite against Japan, the second and the last time which they will do so. In 1945, with the defeat of the Japanese at the end of World War II, the communists and the nationalists once again resumed their fight and their civil war to control China. We'll be coming back to China. Now we move over to Southwest Asia, South Asia, and Africa. Let's talk about Turkey, because the Ottoman Empire is no more. So the Ottoman Empire's forces crumbled during World War I, and the victorious Allied forces immediately sent troops to occupy Anatolia. Although the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire remained on the throne, he had really little power, and he served more as the mere puppet of the British forces and hoped to control the lands of the former empire. During the war, the Turkish nationalist movement organized an army to fight for self-determination of the Turkish people. Led by Mustafa Kemal, the Turkish nationalists defeated British and other forces in 1921. The Republic of Turkey was officially established in 1923 with Kemal, known as the Father of the Turks, installed as its first president. His policies focused on reforming Turkey to make it more like Western democracies. He was determined to create a secular nation as opposed to one with strong Islamic influences. He implemented several reforms, including public education for boys and girls, abolishing polygamy, and expanding the suffrage to include women, giving women the right to vote. As a symbolic gesture, he mainly wore Western suits and hats, and he encouraged others to do the same. In spite of his progressive reforms, though, he ruled as a dictator for 15 years and didn't give up power until 1938 when he died. Let's talk about India. So in South Asia, the Indian National Congress was formed in the late 19th century to air grievances against the colonial government. By the end of World War I, it had become a strong voice for independence. One event in particular, a massacre at Amritsar, radicalized many within the Congress, convincing the Indians that they could not continue living under the British rule. In the spring of 1919, a group of Indian nationalists gathered in a public garden in Amritsar. in Punjab province to protest the arrest of two freedom fighters, Indian freedom fighters. The protest took place during a popular Sikh festival, which had attracted thousands of villagers to Amritsar, a city considered to be holy to the followers of Sikhism. Although the protests were peaceful, the British colonial governments had recently made such public gatherings illegal. Armed British colonial forces fired dozens of shots into the unarmed crowd, killing more than 300 people and wounding thousands. This was the turning point for the nationalist movement. It convinced even the moderate members of the Indian National Congress that independence from Great Britain was the only way forward. In the 1920s, you get a figure I'm sure you've heard of before, Mohandas Gandhi, who had brought the Congress's cause to the Indian masses and caught the attention of the world. Gandhi's Satyagraha, which translates to devotion to truth movement, embarked on a campaign of civil disobedience that encouraged Indians to break unjust laws and serve jail time. So basically, civil disobedience, peaceful non-resistance is another term for it. Gandhi's the first one to do it. Okay, so we're not going to use violence. We're going to be peaceful in resisting. Later, Martin Luther King is going to be inspired by this. These actions, he believed, would stir the consciousness of the empire and the international community and expose the inherent injustice of the British imperial system. Gandhi, who came to be known to Indians as Mahatma, or the Great Soul, led to the boycott of the British goods. He wore Indian homespun cotton rather than suits manufactured in Britain, made from Indian fabrics, but sold back to the Indians at inflated prices. This became symbolic and a practical form of protest against Great Britain. One of Gandhi's campaigns became known as the Salt March. British authorities had made it illegal for Indians to produce their own sea salt. The commodity was easy to make in the tropical country, but Britain wanted a monopoly on the salt. So Gandhi led thousands of Indians to the Arabian Sea and simply picked up a few grains of salt in defiance of Britain's unjust edict. Leaders of the independence movement disagreed, though, on how India should define its national identity. Muslim leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a member of the Muslim minority in the largely Hindu Indian National Congress, originally favored a Muslim-Hindu unity, but later proposed a two-state solution for South Asian independence. So India would become a country and then a separate Muslim country. That would eventually happen. That Muslim country would end up being called Pakistan. So he basically was concerned that Muslim interests would not be well represented in an independent India, hence why he called for this two-state solution. So he proposed a separate Muslim state, Pakistan, made of several leaders, including Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, who eventually became India's first prime minister. And they were very anxious about India's future because of this possible two-state solution. Although independence did not come until after World War II, the interwar years were critical for the movement. Let's talk about Africa. So independence movements in Africa grew out of disappointment for not gaining independence after World War II. Activism with began with European education and educated intellectuals. The middle and upper classes in Africa sent their children to schools in Europe. It was in Europe that these African intellectuals, because they were there to learn, were able to see the discrimination taking place in their homelands. So most of the educated elite worked for the colonial governments if they were not self-employed attorneys or doctors. New forms of nationalism emerged among the elite. For example, the Negritude movement, which took place primarily in French West Africa, emphasized pride in blackness and took the rejection of the French colonial authority. What many refer to now as black pride has its roots in the Negritude movement. Let's look at neocolonialism in Latin America. Neocolonialism refers to the actions taken by one government to indirectly control another country. Neo in itself just means new colonialism. United States is late joining the colonialism practice, and so they began taking control indirectly of other countries. So the Monroe Doctrine, formulated in 1823, stated that European countries would no longer interfere with the affairs of American countries. It was a way to assert U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Less than a century later, in 1904, President Teddy Roosevelt expanded the Monroe Doctrine with his Roosevelt Corollary, when he stated that the U.S. would intervene in the affairs of Latin American neighbors if those countries showed that they could not govern themselves. Okay? Keep your house in order or we'll come into your house. His rationale was that U.S. intervention in Latin American countries would prevent intervention of European power. He wanted the Europeans out of the Western Hemisphere. You can't keep your house in order, we'll come put it in order. But the Europeans sure aren't. In 1912, President William Howard Taft proclaimed a new form of diplomacy with Latin America, which was dubbed as dollar diplomacy. His philosophy basically advocated investing U.S. money rather than U.S. bullets in Latin America. He argued that the region was rich in natural resources such as bananas, oil, and copper, and he felt that it was better for U.S. companies to exploit the wealth before European companies were able to. So the United States wasn't getting involved, but the pockets of corporate America definitely were. U.S. military became involved in the region whenever economic interests, though, were threatened. For example, U.S. Marines were stationed in several nations, including Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In 1933, there's a shift in U.S. policy as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt announces what ends up being called the Good Neighbor Policy, which renounced U.S. intervention in Latin America. The next year, U.S. withdrew troops from Haiti and Nicaragua. That policy, though, came to an end after World War II when fears of communist influence in Latin America led the United States back to its interventionist tendencies, and we will be looking a lot about them in a later chapter. Latin America's resisted U.S. imperialism in many ways. In Nicaragua, Augusto Sandino waged guerrilla war, which is just warfare by confrontation, until he was killed by a Nicaraguan general in 1934. Later, though, rebels called themselves Sandinistas in his honor, and because he was considered a hero. And those Sandinistas you will hear about again in a later chapter. It was a big chapter, guys, but it was a lot of important stuff. But that is chapter 26. Sayonara.